Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Delta E's webinar today. Today's discussion will be on heat as a service, and I am joined by my colleague Rox, who is on the line. Hi, Rox. How are you?
Hi, Arthur. I'm well, thanks. And you?
Hi, Rox. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hi, Arthur. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. All good.
There we go.
So today, share with you the finding of some of the research we have been doing on this topic. A lot of companies have been talking about doing heat as a service, offering some new innovative ways of offering heating systems to customers, and we thought in the last few years we thought about doing more research around this, and this is basically the outcome from our research, and Rox and I are going to talk to you about this through the next 40-45 minutes. It's worth mentioning that this is one of our most attended webinar. More than 500 people have registered for it, where we usually get 200-300 people. So it's really exciting to be talking to all of you today, and we really hope you will enjoy the discussion. So moving on to the first slide of the webinar, when we look at heat as a service, it's actually part of a major global trend of everything as a service, as you can probably see yourself in advertising, in electronics, in all kinds of stuff. All companies are trying to sell you services, and there are some examples that we highlight here. First one being the obvious stuff, as you used to buy your CDs for music, and now you obviously have stuff like Spotify, SoundCloud, etc., who offer you a proper service that you pay monthly and you get unlimited music. You get the same for video with Netflix, Amazon, and others. And you even get now even iPhone as a service, where you just pay a monthly subscription and you get the latest iPhone when something new comes up or when yours is broken. And looking at some research we have done online, you can even get a beer as a service. And as you can see, there are Amazon Web Services summits discussing how they can do advanced beer services. So you can really see the trend moving towards such service, which is quite funny. When looking at this, Rox even found something called socks as a service, which I still struggle to put my head around it, but could be an interesting concept as well. Looking more at the energy side of things, mobility as a service has become quite popular. In some countries, like here in France, I think around 30% of cars are being sold on a leasing contract already, where you just have to pay your monthly fee and you get all the maintenance, insurance, and the car itself, and you don't have to worry about anything. So that's quite an appealing proposition and something that customers really understand and value. And yeah, finally, energy as a service in our industry has become quite a topic of discussion. A lot of companies are talking about it, talking about how to do it, talking about the business models of doing it as becoming one of the key aspects of the core business of companies. So yeah, so heat as a service is within that concept of everything as a service, and we thought it could be really interesting to discuss more about this.
Right. So should we go into our question for the audience now? So before we get into the details of the webinar, we had a quick question that we wanted to ask the audience. So kind of a bit of customer research, if you will. And we'd like you to imagine that you're in a scenario where you've recently bought a house and it has an old inefficient gas boiler in it. So you know the boiler is going to need to be replaced in a few months' time. You do some research and you figure that you have the following options. The first is to just replace it with another gas boiler. Let's say it's going to cost you around 3,000 euros to install, and then after that your monthly heating bills will be about 150 euros a month. That doesn't include any maintenance, repairs, insurance costs. Option 2 is to go with a heat pump because you are conscious of your carbon footprint and you want to reduce it. You are going to buy this heat pump up front. It'll cost about 10,000 euros, but it will reduce your monthly energy bills because in the country where you live, the energy prices are such that your monthly energy bills will be around 90 euros a month. So it'll pay back the extra upfront cost in about 10 years. Again, this doesn't include any maintenance, repairs, or insurance costs. The final option you come across is something called a renewable heat contract. And how this works is that you pay a fixed fee of 150 euros a month, no upfront fee. The contract provider, let's assume here that it's one of the major energy retailers in your country, they will install a heat pump in your home and they'll retain ownership of it. And they'll then supply the energy to it, they'll keep it maintained, they'll optimize the operation to deliver the temperatures that you want when you want them, all within that fixed monthly fee. So for the audience, we're now going to bring up a poll where you can vote for the option that you'd be most likely to go with. Not in an ideal world, but what you think you would actually do in reality if you found yourself in this position.
And while you complete the question, guys, it's worth mentioning that this webinar is recorded. So you will be sent a link if you want to on your email, and you can share it with your colleagues, and the webinar can be watched again on YouTube. If you want the slides after the webinar, feel free to email Rox or myself, and we will share that with you. You have the opportunity to ask questions. So as you can see on the software, you have a question box. And I can see a few questions already coming through. So if you want to ask questions, we will try to follow up on the questions during the webinar, after the webinar if we can't. And yeah, it's a way to interact. So it's not just a presentation. It's a way for you to ask us some tricky questions if you want, and we'll do our best to answer these. So there are questions about the slides being available to download afterwards. Just send us an email, as I said, to Rox and I. You will see our email contacts at the end of the webinar. So send us an email, we'll share the slides with you. And if you want to have a discussion even after the webinar, we'll be happy to discuss this. We have a question already. Why not an option on hydrogen ready boiler? That's a really good question, Simon, thank you. Probably the answer being heat as a service is properly starting with mainstream products like boiler heat pumps, and hydrogen is perhaps not yet mainstream, as you can probably imagine, but we hope to have this sort of new technologies being sold as part of heat as a service packages in the future. So so yeah, that will be one of the future trends that we expect. There are some questions about heat battery versus heat pumps. Yes, again, that's an interesting one. You can imagine perhaps a full energy as a service package where you get PV, battery, and heat pumps. So we actually have an example in this webinar to talk about it. And yeah, heat as a service is perhaps the first start of energy as a service. But yeah, we will focus on this webinar on heat as a service, and there are other research we can share with you later on energy as a service.
So we've got 86% of the votes in. So I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. Get your votes in if you haven't done so already. And
the results of the poll will be available in the slide deck afterwards as well. So if you want to share with your colleagues, that's always interesting. We have around 250 people currently on the line, so that to give you an idea of what percentage you will get. Okay.
Okay, closing the poll and sharing the results.
Okay, so quite expected as coming from the energy industry. Most of you guys will go for the heat as a service or the renewable heat contracts. It's really interesting that the majority of people are already considering buying sort of services. I guess all of us are a bit biased because we follow the market and we're quite excited with the trends coming out. In our customer research, we have, let's say, a similar trend, but perhaps not that much of of number of people willing to take a heater service contract for now. But quite interesting. Thank you, Rox, for organizing this.
Yeah, and there's still 1 in 5 people there saying that they would just buy a gas boiler up front, which is not insignificant.
Yeah, that's correct. I guess it's also the normal, the usual solution, and it's you know, perhaps it's part of your budget to spend 3,000 euro on a boiler every now and then on your house. So it's maybe also the fear of some people of not being, you know, tied to a contract with a maintenance company or an energy supplier. There's some sort of independence towards this. Interesting. Anyway, so we can continue now. So in the webinar, we'll talk about a few things particularly. First one is Rox will help you talk about the framework we use for heat as a service, so how we define it, how we categorize the different offerings in the market. Then we'll talk a bit more about what we see behind the interest. So what are the drivers? What are companies thinking when offering this offer? Well, potentially how customers respond, this sort of stuff. We will provide a few case studies on companies offering service-based business models for heating, so mostly heat as a service, but not only. And then we will share some of our views on how we see that market for heating services evolving in the next 10 years, with some ideas of where the market is going, the trends, why, and it will be interesting actually to get your reactions to this as well. And we will finish the webinar with talking a bit more about the study itself and the subscription service that it's part of. And at any point during this webinar, feel free to ask questions. And as you can see, we're already interrupting quite a lot for your questions. Okay.
Cool. Let's move on. So defining heat as a service, thinking firstly from the perspective of residential consumers, there are 2 things involved in heating your home. The first is the heating equipment. Normally you pay up front when you need a new heating appliance installed, or you buy it on credit. But when people talk about heat as a service, it's often implied that upfront payments would be replaced by monthly payments, either via some kind of finance arrangement or with a rental agreement where the customer effectively just pays to rent the appliance from a service provider. And obviously this then raises opportunities to add on other products or services to that ongoing contract, like maintenance, remote diagnostics, energy efficiency retrofits, etc. The second component of how you get your heat is the fuel that then supplies the heating equipment, so the gas or the electricity. And today the norm is to pay for the number of kilowatt hours of gas or electricity that you consume, or in the case of district heating, the kilowatt hours of heat generated, so the heat output. But there's growing interest in charging customers for outcomes rather than inputs. And by that, I mean the level of comfort or degrees Celsius that a customer wants. And that's usually what people mean when they're talking about heat as a service, coming at it from a more sort of theoretical perspective. Then from a supplier perspective, doing all of this would obviously involve taking on a whole lot of risks that currently are borne by the customer. The first is, of course, the financial risk of financing the equipment. There's the technical risk of maintaining it, the performance risk that comes in when you're charging for the kilowatt hours of heat output or the warmth outcome, because then you need to be concerned about the efficiency of the appliance and sometimes also the efficiency of the heat distribution system. Energy price risks come in when you move from charging for inputs to charging for the outcomes that energy provides. And then in the case of charging for comfort, there's the behavior risk of customers. So for example, if they open their windows more than expected, or if they require more energy at unexpected times, the service provider has to ensure that that is somehow priced in. For any business model, there is also some degree of exposure to regulatory risks. And for a model as complex as this, the risk exposure would be significantly higher than if you were just selling gas boilers or units of fuel. So this is a framework that we use at Delta EE to compare and classify some of the different heating business models that we look at. And of the more sort of innovative ones on the market today, one of the more common ones is asset leasing, or contracts that bundle together finance and maintenance within in a single monthly fee. and those take on only the financial and technical risks. Sometimes the contract also includes some kind of performance or savings guarantee, and we then call that efficient asset leasing. Then in Germany, for example, there are a number of energy suppliers and service providers who offer what they call heat contracting or heat renting, where customers pay a fixed monthly fee for an appliance, and on top of that, they pay a bill for the kilowatt hours of heat produced, all within a single package. And then finally, there is what we would call true heat as a service or warmth as a service, which currently is only being done in trials. And that's where customers pay a fixed fee for a warmth outcome. And we'll look at an example of that later on.
There is a question, Rox, if you go back to the framework on, is there an environmental risk to heat as a service? So for example, leaving heat on and wasting energy and carbon. And I guess that's kind of part of the behavioral risk, right?
It is, yeah. It depends, I suppose, on how your heat is delivered. So if you've got low carbon heat, then technically, no, you can heat as much as you like without that environmental impact. But of course, if you're using gas boilers to provide the heat, then there is an environmental risk, yes.
Yeah. There's another question from Gilles. Hi, Gilles. Have we found any differences between customers' feeling regarding heat as a service between North Europe and Southern Europe? Gilles is saying that in those perspective, it's more accepted in northern countries than southern countries, particularly, I guess, for everything that's rental and things like that. Have you had any thoughts on this, Rox?
So I've just got the results of customer research back, looking at 5 different countries, and I will be analyzing the results and have a better answer to that soon. I'd say I'm not so sure about North and South, but more just market dependence in the markets where customers are more open to sort of leasing style models or rental style models. So the Netherlands, like boiler leasing is not uncommon there. The Germans, people say, are more open to it because they lease their cars more often, but I'm going to have a look and see if we actually see that in the results. So
okay,
we'll
and a final question. Thanks, Rox. A final question before we move on. How often connectivity is used to monitor the boiler appliances to reduce the risk? Or actually, it's a good point, Stefan. In most cases where companies offer maintenance, there is some sort of connectivity linked to the heating system, and because companies take the technical risk, they offer the full package with maintenance and repairs, and they want to optimize as much as possible the operation of the heating system. So in most cases, actually, there will be some sort of connectivity in order to help doing this remote diagnostics and optimizing the operation of the heating system. I guess it's not always the case, but as the connectivity market develops, we will see that more and more often, and most maintenance companies actually putting this now in their offers. So yeah, a growing part of this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite an important part, actually. And a lot of the examples we'll look at later do include either remote monitoring or even remote control. So should we move on to how customers then pay? So when you're providing a service, there are different ways that you can charge customers for that service. The simplest is to pay per use, so where you charge a customer for each unit of whatever it is that they consume. Normally that's units of electricity or gas, but it could also be units of heat or number of warm hours. And warm hours is a concept that the Energy Systems Catapult has come up with in the UK for any hour that a room is heated to a desired temperature level. For those who don't know the ESC, they're a not-for-profit innovation accelerator. And one of the things they've been doing here is to trial selling heat plans with their living lab of 100 UK households who are participating in their trial. The next option is a subscription. And with a subscription model, a customer pays a fixed fee for a specified level of service. So for example, that could be a set cost per month for, say, 250 warm hours or for a specified temperature level. Normally, subscription models have some kind of fair use agreement in the contract or limits above which they would then revert to charging on a pay-per-use basis at a price that's specified in the contract. But in theory, you could also have an unlimited subscription model. So just a fixed fee for as much heat as you want whenever you want it. And that will, of course, be the most expensive option. The last point I wanted to raise, and this has come up now already in the questions, is the differences between the different models in terms of who's actually operating the heating equipment. So in most of the examples we'll look at today, the equipment is effectively still operated by the user. And by that, I mean the user sets the temperature that they want, and the inbuilt control algorithms of the heating appliance determine how it then operates. So it could just be a simple on-off control, but more commonly it's load-dependent modulation. But with heat as a service, suppliers could take control of the heating equipment operation with their own algorithms in order to deliver, say, the desired outcomes more efficiently, or to use the appliances to provide demand response to the grid. And we'll see an example later of how Eneco is trialing this in the Netherlands. Lastly, other variants of as a service that you'll hear about that are related to heat as a service. There's energy as a service, which I'd say heat as a service is a subcategory of energy as a service. Energy as a service is broader in that it includes energy supply for uses other than heating. It might also be defined by different outcomes like carbon savings, and that's what ESCOs do in the B2C space. Sorry, wrong way. Comfort as a service, Arthur, do you want to say what that is?
Yeah, I mean, for those who know me a little already, I have a tendency to like everything around connectivity and services in the home, and comfort as a service is really the next step towards this, where we will live in a world where all the major appliances and devices in the home will be connected. This would include obviously heating and cooling, ventilation, but also everything around lighting, security, peace of mind, etc. And offering, I mean, the number of services you can imagine in the home today is quite wide, but offering a wider single package to customer of comfort as a service for all types of appliances linked to comfort could be quite appealing to customers. Frankly, I would be willing to pay for that because that's a hassle-free and a full service using new technology. So that would be one of the services of the future. We think obviously we are really far from that, and companies saying they are selling comfort as a service is probably not true in our definition. But we see that as a potential business model that will be quite appealing for customers in the future. We have a lot of questions coming through, roughly 5 per minute, so it's quite hard to follow. Rox, we had a small question on the how are operators metering the outputs? Can you talk a bit through how companies like, for example, Viessmann are doing this?
Yeah, so the German models where they're charging for the kilowatt hours of heat output, what they do is they install a heat meter when they install the gas boiler, and that's how they monitor the amount of heat produced in kilowatt hours. And then for the models charging for degrees Celsius or warm hours, that is sensors in the living spaces of customers. So if it's room by room control that they're offering, like what the Energy Systems Catapult is doing, that's sensors in each of the rooms. And in the case of Eneco, they've got the sensor on the living area. And that's how they're measuring the degrees Celsius at the different times of day.
Okay, we'll move on now. Sorry for all the questions that are not answered. We promise we'll follow up with you after that if we don't have time to cover them in the webinar. Now talking about what's behind the interest in heat as a service. So obviously we have all seen this as a buzzword of the market. A lot of companies are talking about everything as service and heat as a service. So if we move on to some of the drivers and opportunities we see, obviously there are more than our list, but we see some of the key ones here. The first one being the technology. So with the emergence of connectivity, with new digital technologies, some of these business models are actually able to emerge in Europe because we can monitor boilers as we talked about before. We can put devices to measure heat output, as Rox just mentioned, and there will be more and more innovations in technology which will help basically these business models be effective. The next one is everything as a service. So we mentioned that in the introduction, but a company like Engie, for example, has set a clear the strategy to say publicly, we want to do everything as a service in our B2C, in our B2B and beyond, to basically become not just an energy supplier, but a service supplier to all our types of clients. And the fact that some companies, major companies like this, are having this strategy really helps creating innovations from startups, from technology companies, and from service companies who are really interested in this. So this is one of the major drivers we see. Demand response and the wider trend in shifting the time of electricity consumption is quite key. You will see a lot of the examples here from gas boilers, because this is the cheapest, easiest technology today. But actually, the problem with technologies like electric heat pumps is the upfront cost. And these technologies, as well as, let's say, hot water tanks, for example, will be key to provide flexibility services. And removing the upfront costs from a heat pump will be critical to install the heat pumps and therefore do flexibility from the heat pumps. So we can see this as one of the key ones. Decarbonizing heat is on the agenda of some of the major governments across Europe and even the world. So this is an example from the UK government mentioning heat as a service in their future framework for heating buildings. So that's, again, a regulatory driver from governments. It's quite interesting. We then have some companies who believe customer loyalty will come from more services, particularly around the things in the home that consume the most energy, and heat is obviously the number one. An example here is OVO, one of the top UK B2C supplier, has in its business plan, in its public investor plan, that heat as a service is one of the core area to develop. That's quite an interesting commitment. Obviously, for some of the big maintenance companies, optimizing costs and generating new revenues is quite important. So instead of having a bottom line every year at zero where we just sell boilers, we will have a recurring revenue model where we sell services, more expensive services than before, instead of just selling appliances. So that's quite important for these guys. And finally, changing routes to market. So in our research, we see a lot of changes in how customers are buying heating systems. Lots more customers are now buying online. It's really moving away from traditional installer routes, and basically companies can capitalize on this by offering something different, something more appealing, something on websites, and customers can more easily sign up for heated service through these routes to market. So that's quite an opportunity for everyone.
Yeah, so what I wanted to just show on this one is, currently the supply chain is such that most manufacturers get their appliances to customers via heating engineers, and that's usually just local tradespeople who have that ownership of the customer relationship. But if instead it was service providers doing the customer facing, and those service providers could be, energy suppliers and manufacturers themselves, the service provider would have very different requirements and buying power from your average heating installer. So for some manufacturers, they see this as a really big opportunity, but for others, it's kind of scary because of how much it would require them to change the way that they operate. So we move on.
We'll talk about some examples of companies doing heat as a service and their offers. In the actual reports, we have a lot more case studies, but we selected a few interesting ones that are quite different from each other to talk to you through.
So we'll start off just with a quick look at the boiler rentals in the Netherlands, where this is particularly popular. The example I've taken is from Feenstra. They're one of the market leaders there, and what they offer is effectively an indefinite contract. It's a fixed monthly fee for as long as you have the boiler. They maintain it, they monitor them remotely, and that enables them to use their in-house technical team as efficiently as possible. Another example of this that is similar but slightly different comes from NG Home Services in France. The difference is that it's a fixed-term finance contract rather than a boiler rental. So for 5 years, the customers pay off the boiler, and that then includes the maintenance for that 5-year period. Also, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, what's really interesting about, it's one of the French examples, so I'm quite well placed to talk about it, but NG Home Services is first of all, white labeling the boiler. So you can see on the boiler here an NG logo. That's one of the strategies we see a lot from heat as a service providers, is potentially to remove the brand name from that and therefore be the central brand of the offer. But they also partner up with a smart thermostat company and developed a remote diagnostics platform behind the offer, so that, as you can see on the risk on the left, not only the leasing risk is taken, but the performance, the technological risk is taken. And NG Home Services, as a big company doing maintenance and repair of boilers in France, can therefore optimize the way they maintain boilers, they repair boilers by understanding what the problems are, potentially reduce the amount of times the plumbers come to visit the house, and therefore optimize the benefits of on the revenues from their heat as a service proposition. So it's quite interesting one, really linking the connectivity in boilers and new services offered to customers.
And the next thing they want to add on to this is the gas supply to the boiler. They're just waiting for the regulations in France to allow that, I believe.
Yep.
Another interesting example comes from Germany, which I mentioned earlier, where some of the big energy suppliers have been offering heat contracting with gas boilers, and they've actually been doing this for several years now. So these include a gas boiler and gas supply, usually on a 10-year contract, so the customer can't switch gas supplier. What's interesting in Germany is that these contracts are also now being offered by new entrants outside of energy, like Mondo, and now also Viessmann, who's recently introduced these 3 packages that you see here for Viessmann affiliated installers to offer to customers instead of selling them a boiler up front. The basic package is just a boiler and finance and the maintenance. Then there's the flex package, which includes gas supply. So the bill that the customers actually get for their heat use will come from Viessmann. And then there is the Green Plus package, which comes with green gas and also Viessmann smart heating controls. So for them, it becomes a way of upselling their products.
And you can quickly imagine the same sort of model with heat pumps, for example, with a Warm's green package, with renewable electricity, for example, as a premium. So again, that's gas boilers is one way to test such proposition, but the actual the end goal is probably looking at electrical technologies after that.
Yeah, and so our next examples are all with heat pumps, I think. So there's this example from the Netherlands, the factory, and they offer what they call e-home subscriptions to replace the gas boilers there with heat pumps and solar panels. I really like this example for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's heat pumps rather than gas boilers. So usually, as you say, heat as a service is spoken about in relation to electric heating. So it's nice to see a commercial example of this. And then secondly, I think the customer proposition is really clear and simple here. There's no upfront cost. You just pay a fixed monthly fee to lease the heat pump and solar panels, and that fee will then be offset by savings on your energy bill. So really easy to understand. Their target market's currently only the top 25% of households in terms of energy consumption, because those are the households in the Netherlands that can save enough money here to make it worthwhile. The second last example is from Denmark. And what they're trying to do there in homes not connected to district heating networks is to provide a similar kind of service, but with individual heat pumps. And they call this local heating as opposed to district heating. And the way it works is there's a fixed monthly fee for the heat pump and then a usage dependent fee for the heat consumed. So similar to the gas boiler models in Germany. The Danish Energy Agency actually introduced a scheme there in 2016 to support some businesses in developing these kinds of propositions. And a few weeks ago, this report came out looking at why they've not been successful, because they've only sold a couple hundred in the last few years. And I've taken a graph out of the report which shows that the propositions actually work out to be more expensive than just keeping the existing boiler or just paying upfront for a heat pump installation. And that's because of the additional costs of the electricity and heat meters, the cost of finance, and the desire of these commercial companies to still turn a profit. And I think this illustrates that, one of the challenges for prospective service providers is how to take on all of these risks and offer the different services at a price that customers are willing to pay. Right, last example, which I said we would touch on, is from Eneco, and this is a trial that they're currently doing in the Netherlands. And this is the one that I would say is true heat as a service. So what they're doing, it's with housing associations and new build properties, and they are supplying households with 20 degrees Celsius and 180 liters of hot water a day using exhaust air heat pumps that are owned by Eneco. The only fee that the tenant has to pay for this is the EPV fee to their landlord, and that's a fee that landlords in the Netherlands can charge for providing an energy efficient property. The landlord then passes part of that fee on to Eneco. Eneco does the EPV reporting and the heat pump maintenance, and they also supply the energy to the heat pumps with wind power. There are also solar panels connected to the system, providing electricity to the grid so that there's net zero on the meter over the year, and hence no electricity bill for the heat pump. There is a separate meter, though, for other electricity use so that the tenants can still switch electricity suppliers on that. Eneco also controls the heat pumps in this case so that they can run the compressors when wind power is available. The tenants can change the temperatures that they want with the smart thermostat that's been installed. They're allowed to do this within their contract, provided that they just don't use more than 5 gigajoules of electricity annually. So Eneco is calling this proposition comfort as a service, but really it's more heat as a service, as it doesn't include other aspects of comfort like cooling in the summer. I think it's a really cool example though, and you can see how it could be adapted for the private retrofit market with different technologies like electric storage heaters, and that's something that companies in the UK, for example, are looking to do.
Thanks, Rox. I've noted down a few questions, and again, sorry everyone if I don't see yours. There are quite a lot. The first one is, what about the other equipments that also go in a boiler room, like for example a hot water tank? Are they part of the service? I guess the factory in the Netherlands also, they have PV and heat pump, but I think they also do hot water tanks, right, Rox? So I guess it's part of the offering.
Yeah, everything that replaces the gas boiler will be leased by the factory. So I think in some cases they have a electric hot water heater rather than using the heat pump for the hot water generation.
Okay, I guess in some cases the boiler room will be with other parts, and perhaps they won't be linked at the start, but the service providers will often in the future try to link all the potential appliances in the boiler room together in order to maximize the benefits from this business model.
Yeah, and I think other appliances in the home as well. For me, this is kind of a first step towards home energy management. Like if you're managing the heating, then why not incorporate other things like EV charging and stuff into it?
Yeah, we had a question on the installation capacity from this service provider. So how do they do this installation? I guess most of them are actually already heating installer companies and maintenance companies. So in a way, their installation capacity doesn't change much from before. Perhaps the main thing is that some installers will focus less on selling heating systems and therefore use their time more for installing what they're good at. So it's maybe a way to optimize the process of selling and installing heating systems. There was a question on are there any players we see coming with this business model outside of the energy space? We can speculate a little bit, I guess, but you can see, for example, Amazon services, Amazon Home Services offering installation for some of the heating equipment, like smart thermostats, for example. So you can imagine Amazon wanting to move a bit more toward that space, but whether they will focus on this or not in the next few years, it's a question mark. Sorry?
People like IKEA looking at providing, solar panels and energy efficiency retrofits, they could certainly look to do something like this.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously you have the tech companies, startups moving into the space. So Thermondo is a good example of that, who was a startup and now became an installer and now is properly a heat as a service provider. And finally, last question before we move on, a quick question on leasing. Are people owning the heating system after the few years contract? Rox, I guess in most cases, if it's 5 years, for example, customers actually own the system once the contract is over. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say anything with a fixed term, the deal is usually that the customer owns the appliance, because it's over that fixed term that they're just paying it off. With the indefinite leasing models like the boiler leasing and the factory, there's not a contract term connected to that, because the idea is that you just pay the service provider for as long as you're leasing the appliance from them. But then if you look at the T's and C's, it will say that, you know, we assume an equipment lifespan of 15 years. And then there are all sorts of clauses around what happens if you like need to leave the property, like say you're moving somewhere new, or if you want to cancel your contract. They give you the options to then buy out the equipment or transfer the contract to a new tenant, or even to come and remove the equipment in the case of the factory, although they've not had to do that yet.
Okay, conscious of time, so we'll have to move on from the questions. I promise we'll get back to you after the webinar if we've missed yours. In terms of future views on how the market will evolve, so that's one of the things we are trying to really put our fingers on is what is the size of the market for service? What are the trends in this space? What are the barriers, etc.? So, Rox, you can talk a bit more about. I talked about the drivers, but perhaps you can talk about the barriers and threats in this market.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that will, you know, stop the market from evolving particularly quickly. I saw one of our questions earlier was, why is heat as a service not more common in the UK? There's a number of reasons. One, I think, is getting the value proposition right. So working out a model that is profitable for both suppliers and affordable for customers, and that's something people are still trying to figure out. So bringing in the sort of demand response revenues if necessary. Often it's energy prices that make it difficult to make something work, or the cost of the equipment itself. So not an easy task. Then there's also the issue that no companies in the value chain really have all the capabilities that they would need to offer heat as a service. So companies are going to need to develop partnerships or acquire those capabilities to do this. The question around installation, you know, the options there are to either bring installation capabilities in-house if you don't already have them, or to subcontract via some kind of agency that has heating engineers. And yeah, there's benefits and risks around going each of those routes. Then there's also managing the risks. You know, we spoke about all the risks that are involved in doing this. So companies need to figure out appropriate risk management strategies. So using the right equipment, getting the contracts right, collecting and analyzing the data to price in the risks, using connectivity appropriately. There's lots of strategies that you can employ. The question is, what is it going to cost to do those, and which are going to be the most effective, and how much do you actually need to do? You know, like the challenge is to still quantify the risks, really. And then also customer demand. You know, heat as a service is an entirely new concept for customers, and we've learned from our own customer research that there are lots of concerns that customers would have about buying heat as a service, and suppliers are going to need to address those concerns and also demonstrate that the benefits are worth the risks for customers. And then also regulations in each of the countries. These will ultimately determine the shape that these models can take in different markets.
And
right.
In terms of where we see this market going, so right now the heating replacement market in Europe is worth about 20 billion euros. And on the graph, you can see in dark blue, basically how much percentage of heating systems are being bought by customers versus lighter blues moving towards renting, or renting plus having the energy as well. And in orange, what we call the fully heat as a service proposition. So you can see by 2030, we expect around 20% of heating replacements to be based with some sort of service, or towards even more heat as a service. And to be honest, it's a conservative view of what we think will happen. it's very possible that the market will move very quickly with the energy transition, with the new energy revolution, towards more services, and heating is becoming one of the key pillars of this transition. So we expect 20% of services instead of less than 1% today, and it's possible that actually this market will move faster because of all the reasons we talked about before. And the real question is, Rox, if you click more, is who will capture the opportunity on this 20+% of the markets? Like, who are going to be the key leaders in each country of services and heat as a service? Who will have the marketing power to make its brand recognized by customers as being one of the most trusted brand for this sort of service? And potentially as well, the size of the pie will increase, because we talked about replacing boilers with, for example, heat pumps, which cost 3 times as much at least. So there is a lot more that can be a lot more value that can be captured from this, and yeah, it's a matter of who will be placed first, who will have the most tests and pilots in order to understand what customer propositions will be appealing, and how to really design your business model in the most efficient way.
Yeah, I'd really like to see progress here, because I think it's a complete paradigm shift, because you would have service providers wanting the same outcomes as customers, so to maximize equipment lifespans and minimize energy consumption, both of which should reduce costs. So it would be really exciting to see progress here, because ultimately it's better for customers at the end of the day, and thus for service providers.
Exactly. So, conscious of time, we'll move on very quickly to the last part of the webinar, talking about how you can learn about heat as a service more. Obviously, we hope that this webinar will help you understand more about this business model. Just to give you an overview of where we come from and where this fits into our research. So for those of you who don't know us, we are quite well implemented across Western Europe and also in Japan, and we do research in most of the markets in light yellow on this map. We have offices in the UK and in France, and we have remote workers across Europe and Japan. So yeah, we follow this market with people on the ground, and we do a lot of research across the globe. We have launched the podcast last year, and we have already more than 20,000 downloads of this since then. And a few of the podcast episodes we have done are looking at heat as a service or related business models with companies like Engie, like Catapult, like Factory, like Greencom, like Schneider, etc. So we have I encourage you to have a look. It's available on Spotify, iTunes, etc. And it's free to download and to listen to. So it's quite interesting one. In terms of what we offer to our clients, as most of you will know, we offer subscription research services and traditional consulting work. The topics you can see in the boxes here are all the kind of pillars we focus on. Heat is actually the one where Delta E comes from originally 15 years ago, and we have been doing a lot of research around that. But we complement that research with everything linked to the changes in the electricity system, with flexibility and storage, with the emergence of EV and EV charge points, with digitalization of energy and devices in buildings, and looking at business models that are emerging across all these pillars. So our expertise is really looking at the whole energy transition across Europe and beyond in the world to help you make sense of what's happening, look at innovations across countries, and perhaps understand what could be relevant for your business. In terms specifically around our heat research, we are dividing this into 3 main areas. The 2 you will see at the bottom are what we call electrification of heat and gas heating, where we look specifically at the trends of these markets from a fuel or an electricity perspective. In these 2 services, we mostly look at the outcome of new emerging technologies like heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps, micro CHP, at the regulations, looking at how these technologies will be implemented across Europe. And in this last service on the top here, called heating business service, we mostly focus actually on the shorter term things in business models. So we look at how competition is impacting the heating markets, how new routes to market are emerging. So I talked about digital online sales channels emerging. That's one of the things we look at the most in this service. We look at new customer propositions like Heat as a service, like remote diagnostics, like the ways that you can sell better services to customers. And we do quite a lot of customer research trying to understand the perspective of the customer on these routes to market and business models. So Heat as a service is a major part of this service, but it's not only it's not the only question that are being asked by our subscribers here. In terms of the study and the research on Heat as a service itself, so you can see a lot of these example slides here, but basically what we have done here is to provide a framework for you to understand a bit more how to categorize different business models here, understand what's in the market. And as you can see, there is a lot of activities across Europe, from the Nordics to the UK, Germany, France, Spain, etc. So it's quite dynamic. It's quite important to understand how companies are offering this and the learnings you can get from that. We are doing a lot of customer research now, as Rox explained, on trying to understand what customers like about Heat as a service, how much they're willing to pay, their fears, how in the future this could evolve, these sort of things. And yeah, continuing to looking more into innovations around this space, both technology and business models. So there is quite a lot that can be done here. If you want to access this research, it's simple. You can subscribe to the research service, or we can also sell you the study on its own. And I think that's all for now. So I can see lots more questions coming through, but we promised to not last over 1 hour. So we will leave it at this for now. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time today to come and listen to our webinar. As I said in the beginning, this webinar was recorded, so it will be available on YouTube. If you want to have the link, just send us an email. You can see our contact details here. If you want the slides, again, just send us an email. We will follow up individually with all of you who have asked questions, or all of you who we want to speak with, in order to continue exchanging about this exciting opportunity. And yeah, feel free to reach out at any point if you want to discuss the market, if you're interested in the studies, or if you want anything else. We are always happy to discuss this. And finally, yeah, so thank you, Rox, for putting all this together, the research and the webinar. That's an exciting topic, and I think we are well placed to help everyone here understand what's going on in the market. So well done to you. Thank you, and bye everyone.
Bye. Thanks very much, Arthur.